In this video, I will talk about the basics of the experimental research, which relates to the manipulation and attention checks, which are the important elements of your experimental research design and need to be carefully planned, carefully executed, and also analyzed before you start the analysis of your main data. Since manipulation and attention checks may sound quite scary, let's jump right into it and clarify those points. Let's first look at the manipulation checks. To contextualize the manipulation checks and explain to you what they are, let's have a look at this example. Let's say we have 3 manipulations, 3 interventions, and the control group, and after our participants have been exposed to them, we are measuring our dependent variable. Since I'm a big fan of random allocation of participants to your experimental group, we are taking this perspective because we are trying to minimize researchers' bias during the allocation of the participants to our groups. When I'm discussing manipulation checks, I'm actually drawing on the work done by Hauser, and it was published in 2017 in the International Encyclopedia of Communication Research Methods. What is a manipulation check? It is a series of questions or a question which you're asking your participants to complete during your experiment. And you are doing this to ensure that they have perceived your manipulation that they have been allocated to the way you intended them to perceive it, that they comprehended it in the way that they were supposed to, that there was no misunderstanding between what you intended them to observe and what they actually inferred, and they reacted in the expected way. Try not to confuse this part of paying attention with the attention check, which I will talk about separately in the second part of this video. Paying attention here on the manipulation check means that if they are providing the expected answer to your manipulation check, it means they comprehended it the way that they comprehended. In other words, they paid attention to what they were reading, to what they were listening to the task they were asked to do. Whatever your intervention was, whatever your manipulation was, they paid attention to it and comprehended in the way that you intended them to do. The purpose of manipulation check is very crucial because it aims to confirm the expected differences between those conditions, those manipulations that you allocated your participants to. And the answers to manipulation check needs to be checked by researchers before you start your main data analysis. And it is conventional that it's been reported in academic papers. In fact, if you read a lot of journal publications, you will see that manipulation check analysis precedes any other analysis. And researchers usually say that the answers in this group were in this direction, and the answers in other group were in this direction, confirming that the manipulation worked as intended. Typically, if your manipulation checks did not work as intended, so you don't see the answer patterns that you expect from the participants in each of those groups, it means that your work is unlikely to be published. And your thesis reviewers, if you're working on your PhD or your master's or your honors degree, they will have lots of questions. Why is that the case? Because in this case, you may not be sure that the participants who were allocated to these 3 groups actually paid attention to your manipulation, that they understood it in the way that was intended to. And it may also raise questions about your overall experimental design and whether you actually executed really good manipulations. And this is why Purdue and Summers in their 1986 work suggest that manipulation check is basically a method to assess construct validity of the experimental manipulation. Construct validity basically means you are measuring what you intend to measure. Why do we also need manipulation checks? Well, it's because the nature of social sciences, of marketing, management disciplines, of psychology is such that we are often interested in very complex, unobserved constructs, psychological processes, perceptions, attitudes. When we try to measure them using the experimental research, or we try to see how they change based on a particular interventional stimuli that we expose our participants to, we need to ensure that our experiment was designed in such a way that it actually captures this complexity. Manipulation checks have actually a very long and fascinating history. And as I was reading Kahn's 2011 work, I actually found that they go back all the way to 1931. This is really exciting, to the work by Farnsworth and Misumi, where they were in experimental design trying to see the effect of fame and judgment on quality of artwork. The first type of manipulation check that we can use as researchers is factual. And as the name suggests, this type of manipulation check is very similar to multiple choice question because it's looking for a correct answer. For example, you can say the message that you have just seen earlier in the survey showed, and here you have the name of the concept for your first experimental condition and then for the second one. Manipulation checks can also be subjective, and they are called subjective because it depends on person's interpretation of the message. And we usually ask them to agree or disagree with the statement, which would be an example of a typical Likert scale, or it could be likely or unlikely, or a semantic differential scale. So here it won't be an example of multiple choice, but it would be a more continuous ordinal sort of level of measurement. And you can anchor your answer option A to one end and option B to the other end. Now, let's have a look at an example to make it more practical. I will stick with the example that I used in my previous videos. I am looking at an intervention where I would expose participants to kinder schema. I'll show a picture of a cute little baby versus a control group, which did not have kinder schema intervention. My first hypothesis is that kinder schema manipulation should create greater positive emotions, and this is my mediator. The positive emotions should be lower in the control group logically. And my second hypothesis between mediator and the dependent variable is saying that higher positive emotions should result in a greater number of purchases made in online shop. Let's have a look at the manipulation checks that can be designed in this type of an experiment. Factual manipulation check, in this case, could be a multiple choice question where we ask them to select the correct answer. It could read as, the message that you have just seen in a survey showed a cute child, a pen, or did not show anything. Now, if you do not want to put the word cute, you can just say a child. If you do not want to use the last answer option, did not show anything, you can exclude it. The subjective manipulation in this case would anchor each of the answer options for your manipulations on the different sides of the ordinal scale. How would you analyze factual manipulation check? As you may have already guessed, you may need to discard those people who answered incorrectly. You need to cross-tabulate your variable where you captured your experimental condition with the answer options on your factual manipulation check. You may see sometimes papers reporting that a chi-square test suggested there were a lot more people who picked a cute child in a cute child condition, or there were more people who picked a pen in a pen condition. My personal preference is to discard people who have provided an incorrect answer. But for me, discarding those who did not provide the correct or expected answer will provide peace of mind that they paid enough attention and they understood my manipulations the way they were intended. When it comes to the subjective manipulation checks, you need to establish statistically significant differences in means between your groups. If there is no statistically significant difference between your control group and the cute child group, then there is obviously a problem. When establishing the mean difference, if you have two experimental conditions, obviously you need to use an independent sample t-test, or if you have three groups or more, ANOVA. And if your data is not normally distributed, you need to use non-parametric tests. Can you have more than one manipulation check question in your experiment? Absolutely. You, in fact, can combine factual and subjective manipulation check and can have 2 or 3 questions. It depends on the complexity of your experiment and also the type of manipulations that you have executed. Where should the manipulation checks be located? Let's have a look again at our example. These were our manipulations. Should manipulation checks be asked right after the exposure? And naturally, they would remember more compared to filling in a lot of questions and in 10 minutes perhaps forgetting about your interventions? Or should it actually be located here after you measured your dependent variable? In providing an answer to this question in relation to the location of the manipulation checks, I'm actually building on Hauser's 2017 work. And they suggest that the preferred location is after you have measured your dependent variable. But at the same time, they also acknowledge that there is a concern that respondents may not remember what they were exposed to if the experimental post-exposure questions are too long. This is usually a potential risk when you run your experiments online, when people don't come into the lab, and you obviously don't have a lot of control over the sequence of the procedures and the speed that they go through the questions. There is also a concern, which has been raised in the literature, that the measurement of the dependent variable may also affect the responses on the manipulation check. If you're concerned that the manipulation checks are too close to the dependent variable, you can include sociodemographic block of questions in there and then ask the manipulation check questions. Create a bit of a gap between the question blocks in your experiment. Let's have a look now at the attention checks. As the name suggests, the purpose of the attention check is to check if they paid attention to, for example, the questions they are reading, that they paid attention as they were completing your questions. Usually, they represent a question where you ask people to select a particular answer option. For example, here I have, please tick strongly disagree if you're reading this question. And if they select another answer option, obviously you need to discard those people because they did not pay attention. If you deal with commercial panel providers to get access to real consumers, to real people, not necessarily student panel providers may not always like those questions because they have to substitute them for you at no cost, and it also signals that the quality of their panels may not be really great. So if you're liaising with different panel providers, make sure you let them know where these attention check would be, because usually they are located sort of in the middle of the experiment, and they will tell you if they would like to increase the cost per participant for you or if it's okay to keep it as it is, as they have originally quoted. Your transparency when dealing with panel providers is crucial because you are telling them that participants may be potentially screened out if they're not paying attention. Now, you may be wondering whether factual manipulation checks, they actually act as attention checks. I would say factual manipulation checks, they are still manipulation checks. You do have to exclude people who provided an incorrect answer on the factual manipulation check. But the idea here is that they actually paid attention and understood your experimental manipulation the way you intended. With the intention check, it can be a question which is located in the middle of your survey. So you are checking whether they are still paying attention as they are going through the rest of the questions that you have planned for them. Another check which I came across in the literature recently was called a conscientiousness check. I found it quite interesting. I came across it in 2019 Journal of Marketing paper by Kamleitner, Thürridl, and Martin. In their experiment, they actually asked people whether they took the questions seriously and answered conscientiously. And then they excluded people who had no. This is a very interesting check in the experiments, and it aims to provide yet another confirmation that people who took part in your experiment, they not only understood your manipulation as intended, or they paid attention, but they also took it seriously and actually answered conscientiously. Now, this is everything which I had for manipulation check and attention check. It was a very technical video, but I hope you understood the difference between those different questions, and now you understand where to place them and how to design them for your experiment.